Middle East Report with James Dorsey on Sabahul Muslim.
It is the Middle East Report, and joining us is James Dorsey. James, thank you very much for your time and welcome to Radio Islam International.
Always a pleasure to be with you.
Let's look at the first story. Palestinian resistance and Israel's harsh response puts the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at the top of the Middle Eastern agenda, even if world leaders try to keep that behind closed doors.
Indeed. So what you're seeing is an uncoordinated Israeli-Palestinian pincer movement, if you wish. On the one hand, you have a Palestinian youth that increasingly has nothing to lose, no longer sees cooperation with and acquiescence of Israel as a way to achieve their national and socioeconomic aspirations, and particularly concentrated in the refugee camp of Jenin, are putting up fierce armed resistance to Israeli forces. And on the other hand, you have a hardline Israeli cabinet, the most Jewish nationalist and ultra-conservative religious cabinet government in Israeli history. And so what that does is it puts countries like the United States, the closest Israeli ally, but also countries like the United Arab Emirates that have forged diplomatic relations with Israel in recent years on the spot. And the question is how long they're going to be able to keep that under wraps. So publicly, you saw in Israel with the visit of the U.S. Secretary of State this week an emphasis on Iran and to a lesser degree on the Palestinians. Behind closed doors, it was exactly the opposite, as well as U.S. concerns about undermining of Israeli democracy by the Netanyahu government.
Let's look at the other story. Saudi sponsorship of this month's FIFA Women's World Cup in Australia and New Zealand sparks criticism.
So Saudi Arabia, on a very broad scale, is trying to use sports, one, as a way of projecting the country, and also as a way of boosting the sports sector and the entertainment sector as part of plans to diversify the Saudi economy. Visit Saudi Arabia, which is essentially the Saudi program to boost tourism to the country, is set to sponsor the FIFA Women's World Cup in Australia and New Zealand. And that is provoking protests, particularly, one, because although there's been significant progress in women's rights in Saudi Arabia, women still do not have full rights. And Saudi Arabia, of course, has a very troubled human rights record. Executions in the country have doubled in the last year, for example. And that, I think, is a foreboding of what's going to happen throughout the rest of this decade as the Saudis sponsor and host various major international sporting events.
Mm-hmm. Iranian anti-government protests move off the street for now.
Indeed. So we've seen months of sustained anti-government protest in Iran, roughly 4 months of it, the most sustained protests in the history of the Islamic Republic and since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. Those protests until now were on the streets. That is changing partly because of winter, partly because of economic concerns as a result of total mismanagement of the economy, as well as U.S. sanctions against Iran, and partly because of the very harsh response of the regime to the protests. But that doesn't mean that something hasn't fundamentally changed in Iran. And it also doesn't mean that protest has ended. You're seeing a lot of individual protest, women going down the streets and risking fines for not wearing the hijab. And there is no doubt in the question of in the mind of an analyst that ultimately this was round one, and we are going to see a second round.
Mm-hmm. Finally, the Middle East is central to creating the building blocks of a 21st century world order.
Indeed. So the question is, what do Moroccan arms sales to Ukraine or transnational Russian-Iranian transit corridor across Eurasia or U.S. assistance to Saudi Arabia in developing a national strategy have in common? Well, what they have in common are that these are, on the one hand, responses to immediate concerns that individual states may have, but they also create the building blocks of what is going to be a new 21st century world order. And they are clearly attempts in what probably will be a bipolar U.S.-Chinese order, with Russia having taken itself out of the equation as a result of Ukraine. But it's also going to be a world order in which multiple middle powers, Middle Eastern middle powers among them, are going to have significant enhanced agency and hedging capabilities and want to capitalize on that.
Mm-hmm. Now, before we let you go, James, just a quick reference to the website for our listeners who are interested in reading more of your stories and your articles.
Thank you. You can see everything I write and my podcasts at www.jamesmdorsey.net. You can subscribe for free. Having said that, the website is and the articles are read by policy analysts, policy makers, journalists, academics across the globe, and to maintain that that kind of impact, I am trying to keep the website free of charge. Paid subscribers are more than welcome to help me cover the monthly cost of the column.
Lovely. James, thank you very much for your time, and we'll catch up with you next week.
Absolutely, and thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity.
Bye-bye.